It happened on a Friday night. The kind of night where the world outside feels hushed, yet inside everything in your mind is loud. Daniel had called earlier in the day to say he'd be working late again, not unusual. But the tone in his voice was distracted, curt, almost like he was talking to a stranger. I told myself not to read into it, but that creeping, unshakable feeling of distance between us was starting to feel like more than just work stress. Around 8:30, the building's power went out. A sudden silence. No hum from the fridge, no streetlight glow through the window was unsettling. I lit a candle in the kitchen and pulled a sweater over my shoulders. Then came the knock. Soft, almost hesitant. I opened the door to see Ethan standing there, flashlight in one hand, a half smile on his lips. "Figured you might not like sitting in the dark alone," he said. I almost told him I was fine, but the truth was, I wasn't. And something about the way his voice carried in the dim hallway made me step aside without thinking. He set the flashlight on the counter, the beam casting a pale glow over the room. We ended up sitting at the kitchen table, talking, in the flickering light of the candle, about small things at first. The weather, the way the building's wiring was ancient and cursed. But then, without meaning to, I told him more. About work, about Daniel's absences, about how I felt like I was disappearing inside my own life. He listened, really listened, without interrupting, without glancing at a phone, without shifting. Impatiently. It had been so long since I'd had someone's full attention that I didn't realize how much I craved it until that moment. At one point, he reached across the table, his fingers brushing mine. The touch was light, almost accidental, but it sent a current through me I wasn't prepared for. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "we wait for people to notice we're drowning, that they're too far away to see it. Doesn't mean you don't deserve someone who's close enough to pull you out." I swallowed hard, my pulse in my ears. Ethan. The silence between us stretched, heavy with something unspoken. Then, as if the universe wanted to push things further, my phone buzzed. A rare thing during a blackout. It was a text from a friend, and it made my breath catch. "Saw Daniel tonight at the restaurant downtown. He wasn't alone." My chest tightened. I stared at the words, feeling the room tilt. Ethan's eyes searched mine. "What is it?" I told him. Or rather, I let the words stumble out, my voice shaking. I didn't cry. Not yet. But the ache in my chest was so sharp, I thought I might. Ethan stood, walked around the table, and rested his hand on my shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. And that's when it happened. The moment that would change everything. I stood too quickly, and suddenly we were inches apart. The candlelight flickered between us. My breath caught. His eyes held mine, and for a moment the world outside ceased to exist. I didn't plan it. I didn't even think. But I kissed him. It wasn't soft at first. It was desperate, a collision of loneliness, confusion, and need. He kissed me back like he had been holding himself back for weeks. My hands found the warmth of his face. His fingers tangled in my hair, and for a few minutes, I forgot entirely about Daniel, about my marriage, about the morality of the moment. The sound of the power snapping back on startled us both. The fridge hummed to life, the lights blinked on, and reality came rushing back in like a cold wave. I stepped back, my heart pounding. I shouldn't have. Ethan looked at me, his expression unreadable, then said softly, "You're not the only one who's been feeling alone." The next morning, I found myself replaying the kiss over and over. Part of me was furious with myself for crossing a line, for letting my emotions get tangled with a man I barely knew. But another part, the part that had felt dead for so long, was alive again. I thought I could bury it, pretend it hadn't happened. But later that afternoon, my phone buzzed again, this time from Daniel. "We need to talk tonight." When he got home, his expression confirmed everything I feared. He admitted he'd been spending time with someone from work. He didn't use the word affair, but I didn't need him to. I sat there, numb, realizing that while I had been starving for affection in my marriage, he had been finding it elsewhere. And yet, my own lips still carried the ghost of Ethan's kiss. The betrayal was mutual now, even if neither of us wanted to admit it outright. Here's the part you won't believe. 2 weeks later, Daniel moved out. 3 weeks after that, Ethan knocked on my door again. Not with food, not with tea, but with a quiet look in his eyes that told me he still remembered that night, as vividly as I did. And standing there, I realized that his unexpected kindness hadn't just surprised me. It had rewritten the ending of a chapter one thought I was doomed to stay in forever. For the next few days after Ethan's breakfast delivery, I found myself noticing him more. Noticing the way his laugh carried lightly down the hall when he spoke to someone on the phone. The way he always held the elevator for others, even if it meant he'd have to squeeze in at the last second. The way he seemed present in a world where most people were half distracted. I told myself it was nothing, just harmless curiosity about a neighbor who'd been unusually kind. That I'd be lying if I said his face didn't linger in my thoughts longer than I intended. One rainy Tuesday evening, the surprise came. It had been a draining day, the kind that left me feeling like a shadow of myself. Work had been tense. The layoff rumors were no longer whispers but open conversations in the break room. My boss had pulled me aside to say my position was secure for now, which somehow felt less like reassurance and more like a countdown I couldn't see. When I got home, I dropped my bag, kicked off my heels, and sat on the couch without turning on the lights. I just needed quiet. But then, another knock on the door. I sighed, half expecting a delivery for one of my neighbors. But when I opened the door, it was Ethan, this time holding a small umbrella in one hand and what looked like a grocery bag in the other. "You weren't at the mailbox earlier," he said. "So I grabbed your letters before the rain ruined them. And I brought you something." I stared at him, caught off guard. "You didn't have to." "I know," he said, cutting me off gently. "But I wanted to." Inside the bag was a container of homemade soup, a loaf of fresh bread, and, of all things, a tiny packet of tea labeled for stress relief. I felt something tighten in my chest. It wasn't the food itself. It was the fact that he had noticed, again, that I wasn't quite okay. No one else had. Not my co-workers, not my friends, and certainly not Daniel. I had gotten so used to holding myself together alone that I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone see me. "Ethan, this is really thoughtful," I managed. He gave me that same soft smile as last time. "Thought you could use a little comfort. And you look like someone who doesn't make soup for themselves." I laughed, an actual laugh, the kind I hadn't felt in weeks. "You're not wrong." He didn't linger. He didn't ask to come in. He just said, "Good night," and disappeared down the hallway, leaving me standing there with soup and tea and a warmth in my chest I couldn't name. That night, as I sipped the tea, I realized how foreign this feeling was. Ethan's kindness wasn't loud or performative. It wasn't the kind that demanded acknowledgement. It was quiet, intentional, and real. It took me by surprise in a way I didn't even understand yet. Because I had been convinced, for months, maybe years, that no one in my life would go out of their way for me without a reason. My marriage had turned into a transaction of responsibilities. My friendships had thinned out into occasional texts. And here was a neighbor, someone who owed me nothing, choosing to care. A few days later, the surprise deepened. I was coming home late from work, exhausted and soaked from an unplanned downpour. My phone had died hours earlier, and I'd been too drained to even stop for groceries. As I stepped out of the elevator, I saw a small box outside my apartment door. A note was taped to the top. Rainy days should come with warm bread. Inside was a still warm bakery loaf wrapped in brown paper, and a little jar of honey. I leaned against my door, staring at it, wondering what kind of person did things like this without expecting anything in return. I didn't know whether to feel grateful or unsettled by how much it meant to me, because the truth was, I had started to look forward to these small moments. The knocks on the door, the unexpected gifts, the way my mood shifted almost involuntarily when I heard his voice in the hallway. That, more than the bread, more than the soup, was the real surprise. I had been living in a kind of emotional drought for so long that I didn't realize how thirsty I was until someone started pouring water into my life. What I didn't know then was that this kindness, the very thing that surprised me, would soon become complicated, because kindness has a way of opening doors you didn't mean to open. And once they're open, it's not always easy to close them again. It started on a day when everything already felt heavier than usual. The air outside was thick with the scent of rain-soaked pavement, and the sky had that grey, restless look that made you feel like something was about to break. Whether it was the weather or you. I was standing in my kitchen, staring at the half-empty cup of coffee I'd reheated twice, knowing it had gone cold again, just like so many things in my life lately. Life had been complicated. Bills stacked on the counter, unanswered messages blinking on my phone, an annoying loneliness I didn't want to admit to anyone. My husband Daniel was away for work more often than not these days. When he was home, he felt distracted, detached, as if his body was there but his mind was miles away. Our conversations had turned into shallow exchanges about groceries, utility bills, and his travel plans. Somewhere along the way, the warmth between us had cooled. The only human interactions I had most days were the polite, passing nods with my neighbors in the hallway. I never lingered, never got personal. I had convinced myself that keeping my distance meant keeping my life simpler. But that morning, I realized how isolating that simplicity had become. I had barely slept the night before, tossing and turning over an email from my boss that hinted at layoffs coming soon. My job was one of the few stable things I had left. Losing it would shatter whatever fragile balance I'd managed to maintain. Was still in that anxious spiral when I heard a knock on my door. Not the quick, casual knock of a delivery driver, but a slow, deliberate tap. When I opened it, there he was. Ethan was my neighbor from 2 doors down. I didn't know much about him except that he moved in about 6 months ago, drove an old black Jeep, and had a smile that seemed to appear and disappear too quickly for you to read it. He was younger than me by maybe 5 or 6 years, tall with warm brown eyes that somehow looked both curious and cautious at the same time. "Hey," he said, shifting the paper bag in his hands. "I made too much breakfast. Thought you might want some." I blinked, certain I'd misheard him. Too much breakfast? Who even does that in real life? Before I could protest, he held the bag out toward me. "It's nothing fancy. Just pancakes, eggs, and coffee. I figured it'd be better than whatever you were having." His eyes flicked toward my counter, where my sad, cold coffee cup sat like evidence. I hesitated, partly because I didn't want to seem needy, and partly because I didn't understand why he was doing this. We weren't friends. We hadn't shared more than a few good mornings in passing. But there was something in his tone, casual, but not careless, that made it hard to refuse. "Thank you," I said, taking the bag. "You're welcome," he replied, and his smile lingered this time, softer, almost knowing. When I set the food on my table and opened the containers, I felt a surprising lump in my throat. The pancakes were still warm, the eggs perfectly fluffy, and the coffee smelled rich and strong. It wasn't just about the food. It was the fact that someone had thought about me. Enough to notice I might need something better than reheated leftovers and a lonely morning. I told myself it was just a neighborly gesture, but the truth was, I couldn't remember the last time someone had done something kind for me without expecting anything in return. Later that day, I ran into Ethan again in the hallway. I thanked him for breakfast, and he shrugged like it was nothing. But then, he said, "You just looked like you could use a better start to your day." That simple observation hit harder than I expected. It meant he'd noticed, not just my coffee, not just my tired eyes, but me. In a world where even my own husband barely noticed when I was drowning, that felt different. It was that moment, the quiet, unassuming kindness that shifted something in me. I didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of a story I never saw coming. From there, I can build this into the emotional layers. Her vulnerability, his quiet presence, and the seed of trust that will eventually grow into something far more complicated.